Have you ever applied fertilizer perfectly, only to watch your crops still struggle with yellow leaves and weak growth? It's the ultimate agricultural paradox. Your soil can be loaded with nutrients, and yet your plants are still starving. Today, we are going beyond the bag to uncover the hidden science of nutrient mobility, the real dividing line between average farming and precision agriculture. We will reveal why the total volume you apply isn't what matters. It's about understanding the language of the root and how nutrients actually move. Stick around to find out if your nutrients are actually missing from your field or if they are simply chemically locked away by a single hidden factor you might be overlooking.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into the hidden science of nutrient mobility. Look, if you've ever worked the land or honestly even just tried to keep a backyard garden alive, you know the absolute frustration of watching crops struggle. And what if I told you that simply dumping more fertilizer on the problem is almost never the answer? We're going to figure out how the invisible mechanics of the soil can totally transform how your plants actually grow.
It all starts with a rather agonizing reality. We call it the agricultural paradox. Think about it. Why do heavily fertilized crops still starve? It kind of completely defies our basic intuition, right? We naturally just assume that if a farm is loaded with nutrients, well, the plants should be thriving. But time and time again, we see fields where the soil is absolutely rich, but the crop is visibly suffering.
It's a really painful irony. On one side, you have perfectly applied premium fertilizer. On the other, a yellowing, struggling leaf. You know, so many growers do everything right by the book. They apply fertilizers correctly, in the exact right quantities, and they still get weak growth, yellow leaves, poor fruiting, just utterly disappointing yields. The nutrients are right there in the dirt. So what is actually going wrong? Well, the real issue isn't the fertilizer itself, it's the physical movement of those nutrients, both out in the soil and inside the plant itself. Total volume applied simply does not equal total volume absorbed. Just because a nutrient is sitting out there in the dirt absolutely does not mean it actually makes it into the plant's metabolic system. And this brings us to a massive paradigm shift. The dividing line between average farming and true precision agriculture is nutrient mobility. Average farming treats the soil like an empty bank account. Just make a deposit and you're good to go. But precision agriculture, it realizes the soil is way more like a dynamic, bustling city. Mastering how nutrients physically and chemically navigate that city is literally your key to stepping into the modern era of agriculture. To see this in action, let's track a specific nutrient, nitrogen. Now, nitrogen, which plants absorb in forms like nitrate and ammonium, has very high soil mobility. It moves incredibly easily through the soil profile. And hey, this is fantastic because it allows for rapid crop absorption when the plant is actively feeding. But it's a double-edged sword. It creates a massive vulnerability. Because of that super high mobility, nitrogen is incredibly susceptible to its environment. Heavy rains or over-irrigation can cause rapid leaching. The water literally grabs those nitrates and washes your expensive fertilizer investment right past the root zone, deep into the subsoil, way before the plant can even feed on it. So you applied the right amount, but that high mobility just washed it right away. Okay, so what happens when a nutrient has the exact opposite problem? Let's contrast nitrogen with calcium. Calcium is absorbed by roots, sure, but once it gets inside the plant, it has very low mobility. It relies entirely on passive transport. This means once calcium is deposited in older tissue, it barely moves. It's essentially trapped. It creates a massive internal transport bottleneck, kind of like an impossible traffic jam right inside the stem. Because of this internal immobility, the plant can't easily reallocate calcium to where it's needed most for new development. And this is exactly why calcium deficiency strikes new leaves, developing tomatoes, peppers, and young tissues first. You'll see things like blossom end rot, and you might think, oh, my soil is depleted. But actually, the surrounding soil is probably absolutely loaded with calcium. It's like buying really expensive groceries but leaving them locked in the trunk of your car. The plant physically cannot move it to the new fruit. Then we have phosphorus, which throws a completely different hurdle into the mix. Phosphorus has incredibly low soil mobility. It moves exceptionally slowly in the soil matrix. Because it doesn't just flow to the roots with water the way nitrogen does, uptake only happens if the plant's roots physically grow out and reach the specific, tiny pocket where the phosphorus is hiding, which leads to a pretty powerful realization. Even in heavily fertilized fields, poor root systems
automatically guarantee phosphorus deficiency. Without the physical infrastructure of healthy, expansive roots to go out and literally mine those stationary nutrients, the phosphorus remains completely out of reach. Seriously, it doesn't matter how much you applied. If the roots can't touch it, the plant can't eat it. So let's quickly recap the physical barriers we've talked about so far. We are dealing with two opposite ends of the spectrum here. On one hand, we have the high loss risk nutrients, like nitrogen and magnesium. They absorb quickly, but they're highly vulnerable to leaching and washing away. On the other hand, we have the high lockout risk nutrients, like calcium and iron. They move super slowly, either getting stuck out in the soil matrix or trapped inside old plant tissue. That brings us to our next major hurdle, the chemical lockout. This is when nutrients are totally paralyzed by soil chemistry. You see, physical distance and internal transport aren't the only barriers. Think of this next one like a pH padlock. Micronutrients like zinc, iron, and boron are highly sensitive to soil chemistry. If your soil pH shifts even slightly out of the optimal range, it completely locks up these sensitive elements. The nutrients undergo chemical reactions that make them entirely insoluble to the plant. And the result of this padlock? Well, it's pretty much a tragedy for the grower. Crops are left utterly hungry, showing severe deficiency symptoms while literally sitting in a banquet of nutrient-rich soil. The elements are right there. They're physically touching the roots, but chemically, they might as well be on the moon. And this brings us right back to that core paradigm shift. The old mindset simply asked, is the nutrient missing from the soil? And the knee-jerk reaction was to just dump more fertilizer. But the modern mindset asks something totally different. Is the nutrient physically or chemically blocked? The solution isn't just more volume, it's fixing mobility, optimizing root health, and balancing that pH. Because the most profitable farmers out there, they don't necessarily use the most fertilizer. Instead, they manage what we call the precision agriculture ecosystem. They step away from just obsessing over isolated inputs, and they actually understand how plants feed, managing the entire interconnected system. So how do we actually put this into an actionable strategy? It comes down to 6 pillars of precision farming. You're managing soil chemistry to prevent those padlocks. You're understanding nutrient mobility profiles. You're building healthy roots for the slow movers. You're managing moisture to stop leaching. You're timing your applications perfectly. And finally, you're balancing nutrient interactions so absolutely nothing gets chemically locked out. Now, why does all this matter to you? Well, because mastering this interconnected ecosystem approach has massive, very tangible benefits. It saves you serious money on wasted inputs, for sure, but it also significantly improves the quality of your yield by ensuring complete nutrition. And crucially, it protects your long-term soil health by preventing the toxic buildup of unused synthetic fertilizers. The next time you walk your field, your greenhouse, or your backyard garden, and you see signs of a struggling crop, before you automatically reach for another bag of fertilizer, ask yourself this one vital question. Is the nutrient actually unavailable in the soil, or is it simply inaccessible to the plant? Understanding the difference truly changes everything. There is a fascinating, literally invisible chemistry happening right beneath our feet. I mean, we walk over it every single day, but the soil is actually teeming with this hidden language of growth that dictates how everything around us survives and thrives. In this explainer, we're going to zoom way in on the exact microscopic mechanics of how plants actually feed themselves, and then we'll zoom all the way back out to see how that impacts the very food system we all rely on. So, do plants actually eat dirt? It sounds like a silly question, right? But honestly, think about it. When we look at a massive oak tree or a towering stalk of corn, a super common misconception is that the plant is somehow, chewing up the solid dirt around it to build all of that mass. But that's not how it works at all. To really understand agronomy, we have to look much deeper, past the solid dirt and into a microscopic liquid world. Here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll start with the fertilizer imperative, unpack the language of roots, dive into classifying the elements, explore the drama of soil versus plant mobility, look at the nitrogen exception, and finally, decode commercial fertilizers. Let's kick things off with Section 1, the fertilizer imperative. To understand why human intervention in agriculture is even necessary in the first place, we really just have to look at the math. This brilliantly illustrates the core issue every single farmer faces. The small bar on the left, that represents the existing available reserves of elements naturally found in the soil. Meanwhile, that massive bar on the right shows the actual nutritional requirements of a growing crop. Just look at that stark deficit.
In almost all modern crops, what the plant demands far, far exceeds what the dirt alone can provide. So this massive gap makes adding fertilizer not just an option, but an absolute necessity to sustain our food supply.
Moving right along to section 2, the language of the root.
Okay, so knowing that we have to introduce nutrients to the soil, we need to understand exactly how the plant is going to interact with them at the biological level. Like I mentioned earlier, roots don't have teeth. They absolutely cannot process a raw, solid chunk of mineral, no matter how nutrient-rich it might be. A raw mineral must first be completely dissolved into the soil solution. Notice how it breaks down into a specific electrically charged ion, like K+ for potassium. Only then is it recognizable to the root membrane, allowing biological absorption to finally happen. This brings us to a really crucial definition, the radical uptake form. This is the exact dissolved ionic state, whether that's positively charged, like a cation, or negatively charged, like an anion, that a nutrient must be converted into before a plant can literally recognize it and pull it through its cell walls. Think of these ions as the literal vocabulary, the specific chemical language that the root speaks. If a nutrient isn't in its proper radical uptake form, well, the plant is completely blind to it.
All right, section 3, classifying the elements.
Now that we know the language roots speak, let's look at the specific vocabulary words they need the most. These are the primary macronutrients, often referred to as the heavy lifters of plant growth: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Notice the specific radical uptake forms for each one. Nitrogen is absorbed as NH4+ or NO3-. Phosphorus is incredibly complex, taken up as various negatively charged phosphates, like H2PO4-. And potassium is absorbed as the simple K+ cation. These are the elements plants consume in massive quantities, demanding a constant ready supply in the soil solution. Next up, we have the secondary nutrients. Now, while they aren't needed in quite the same massive bulk as those heavy lifters, they are absolutely vital as the structural foundations of the plant. Calcium is absorbed as C+2, magnesium as Mg+2, and sulfur as the sulfate anion, SO4-2. Without these specific ionic states present in the soil moisture, a plant simply cannot build strong cell walls or produce essential enzymes. It just wouldn't work.
Now for section 4, soil versus plant mobility.
This is where we reach the central drama of this invisible world. Just because you put a nutrient into the soil, and even if it's perfectly in its correct radical uptake form, it does not mean it's going to effortlessly make its way to the plant. The contrast with phosphorus is fascinating here. In the soil, phosphorus has bhaja, or incredibly low mobility. It barely moves at all. It basically gets tied up in the dirt almost instantly. Because it won't move to the roots physically have to grow out and find the phosphorus. But the second that root absorbs it, the rules completely change. Inside the plant's internal vascular system, phosphorus is highly mobile, flowing freely up and down the stem to wherever the plant needs it most.
To really wrap our heads around this, let's map it out on the mobility matrix. On the horizontal axis, we have soil mobility. On the vertical axis, plant mobility. Look where phosphorus is hiding, way over on the left, meaning it barely moves in dirt, but high up, indicating it moves great inside the plant. But now, check out the lower left corner. You'll see micronutrients like iron and manganese. These have incredibly low soil mobility, and get this, that is highly dependent on soil pH. If the soil pH gets too high, it's like a vault door shutting. These micronutrients become completely locked away in the dirt, entirely invisible to the plant. This matrix is absolute proof that soil dynamics and internal plant dynamics operate on completely different rules. Let's contrast phosphorus starkly with calcium. If you remember from the matrix we just looked at, calcium sits right in the middle for soil mobility. It moves reasonably well through the damp soil. But look at its plant mobility, very low. Once a plant absorbs calcium and builds a cell wall with it, it gets stubbornly locked in place. The plant cannot scavenge calcium from old leaves to send to new growth. It is physically stuck. What does that mean practically? It means a farmer must ensure a constant, steady stream of calcium to the roots throughout the entire growing season, purely because the plant can't move it around internally.
Which brings us to section 5, the nitrogen exception. We've seen nutrients that get stuck in the dirt and nutrients that get stuck in the plant. But now we have to talk about the ultimate rule breaker, nitrogen. It is widely considered by agronomists to be the most volatile and dynamic macronutrient to manage in the field. It requires incredible precision, and to understand why, we have to look at its highly unique chemical pathways. Nitrogen's soil mobility is off the charts, incredibly high. And notice here, it actually has two distinct ionic pathways or radical uptake forms. Pathway A is ammonium, and pathway B is nitrate. Because it moves so incredibly fast through the soil with water, and because it actively transforms between these different states, nitrogen is incredibly rebellious. It is highly susceptible to just leaching away or completely evaporating into the atmosphere long before the plant's roots even get a chance to absorb it. And finally, Section 6, Decoding Commercial Fertilizers. Now that we've mapped out how plants absorb these microscopic ions and how they move or don't move through the soil, let's zoom all the way back out to the macro level. Notice the volatile, electrically charged radical uptake forms the plant actually eats, like the phosphates K+, Ca+2, and Mg+2. Now compare that to industrial commerce. When you go buy a bag of fertilizer, the industry expresses those elements in stable oxide equivalents. That is exactly why the bag says P2O5 instead of H2PO4-, or K2O, CaO, and MgO. You can't just toss a highly reactive, raw, dissolved ion into a dry bag and ship it on a truck. It has to be stabilized as an oxide equivalent for transport, which the soil moisture will later break back down into the radical uptake form the roots are actively searching for. And here it all is, pulled together into one master reference guide. This dense, authoritative cheat sheet synthesizes our entire journey in this explainer today, from the element itself, tracking its unique behavior in the soil, its completely separate behavior inside the plant tissue, the specific ionic language of its radical uptake form, all the way to how it's legally expressed on a commercial fertilizer label. Understanding this chart, that means you understand the very foundation of modern crop nutrition. Which brings us to one final thought. The next time you sit down to eat, just think about the immense, complex, microscopic journey those nutrients had to take. From stable oxides in a bag, dissolving into volatile ions in the soil solution, navigating the treacherous mobility matrix and pH levels of the dirt, communicating with a blind root membrane, and finally building the cellular structure of your meal. How does understanding this invisible chemistry change the way you view the food on your plate? Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. Keep asking questions, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.
Welcome to the debate. So imagine standing inside a bank vault filled with millions of dollars. The money is stacked like right in front of you. But your hands are tied behind your back. You are surrounded by wealth, yet completely broke.
Yeah, that is honestly the perfect metaphor for a massive frustration happening on farms around the world right now. It's the agricultural paradox. Farmers apply, perfectly calculated volumes of fertilizer, yet their crops still suffer from weak growth or yellow leaves.
They are literally starving in nutrient-rich soil.
Exactly. Starving while completely surrounded by food.
And it brings up a really fascinating divide in how we understand farming. The expert agronomist, Dr. Fuad Amlal, he recently pointed out that in modern precision agriculture, you have to diagnose whether a nutrient is physically unavailable in the soil or chemically inaccessible.
Right, you have to know exactly which barrier you're hitting.
Exactly. And I look at this and see, well, primarily a physical failure mode. Plant survival is governed by physical soil mobility and root reach. I mean, if a crop cannot physically access the nutrients in the soil matrix, it fails.
But see, looking at physical reach ignores the fundamental biology of a plant. Like a root physically touching a piece of raw phosphorus means absolutely nothing.
Wait, nothing?
Well, nothing if the chemistry is wrong. The true barrier is chemical lockout. If the soil chemistry is off, the plant basically sits in a nutrient buffet with its mouth glued shut.
Okay, but how can you discount the physical environment? Nutrient mobility in the soil strictly dictates what a plant can even absorb. Take nitrogen, for example.
Sure.
It has extremely high soil mobility, moving easily through the dirt. Now, that allows for rapid root absorption, but it creates a massive physical vulnerability, like heavy rain will literally wash the nitrogen right past the root zone.
Right.
That leaching is a pure physical washout. And then on the flip side, look at phosphorus. It barely moves in the soil at all. So if a crop has a poor root system, it just cannot physically reach those scattered nutrient pockets.
You're assuming that physical proximity equals absorption, though. Roots are completely blind to raw elements. For a plant to eat, nutrients must be converted into what we call radical uptake forms.
Right, the ionic state?
Yes. Because roots absorb nutrients through water, raw elements have to be dissolved into charged ionic particles
to actually pass through cellular membranes, and that process relies entirely on the soil's chemical balance.
Sure, they need to be dissolved, but
But it's way more fragile than just getting them wet. Consider the pH padlock. Micronutrients like zinc and iron are incredibly sensitive to soil chemistry.
oh right, the crystallization.
Exactly. If the pH level gets just a little too high, those micronutrients bind with oxygen and hydrogen in the soil to form solid crystals. And those crystals are simply too massive to pass through the root membrane. So the nutrients are physically right next to the root, but they're chemically padlocked.
I understand the mechanics of the pH padlock, I do, but I don't think it's the ultimate bottleneck. Let's look at calcium.
Okay.
Even if your soil chemistry is pristine and calcium is perfectly dissolved in its radical uptake form, a plant will still show severe deficiencies in new leaves and tomatoes. Why?
Well, the transpiration.
Because once inside the plant, calcium gets physically stuck in the old tissue. That is a pure physical transport failure inside the plant's plumbing.
I wouldn't call that just a plumbing failure, though. It's physiological chemistry. Calcium moves upward through the plant via the transpiration stream.
Right, it follows the water.
Yes, it only travels when water evaporates from the leaves, pulling more water up from the roots, like a water-powered elevator. If the environment is too humid, evaporation stops, the elevator breaks down, and new leaves starve.
Okay, fair.
And going back to your nitrogen example from earlier, you called leaching a purely physical washout. But nitrogen's massive volatility is actually driven by chemistry.
How so?
Well, it exists in two different radical uptake forms, ammonium and nitrate. One binds tightly to soil particles, and the other repels them and washes away. So the chemical state decides its fate long before the rain ever hits.
That is a fair distinction, but you still need moisture management, which is a physical lever, to control that leaching environment. However, I think this really highlights the danger of the old farming mindset. We used to just ask, is the soil out of nitrogen, then dump more fertilizer?
Right, the old brute force method, which perfectly illustrates Dr. Onlow's field testimony. Total volume applied does not equal total volume absorbed. We really have to view the farm as a holistic ecosystem.
Absolutely.
Managing root health and soil moisture is vital. Yes, but I still maintain that if you don't unlock the invisible chemistry first, your physical infrastructure is basically useless.
And I'd argue that the best chemistry in the world won't save a plant that can't physically reach its food. Which brings us right back to our bank vault from the start.
Yeah, true.
If we want crops to thrive, we have to untie the plant's hands. Do you prioritize building better physical access roads to the vault or picking the chemical lock on the door? We'll leave that for you to decide.